Hmm, More people are in. Taz, I'm going to start. I think more people will join as we go along with the introduction. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar series. My name is Chris, Operations Director at Civil Service College. I am facilitating today's webinar. Civil Service College webinars aim to connect public sector colleagues in the UK and abroad with our expert trainers. Our webinars look at topical issues and its application with real-life examples. If today is your first time joining our webinar series, you are very welcome, and I hope you will like it. For our alumni, welcome back. Let me start off with a very brief introduction to Civil Service College. So if we go on to the next slide, please, Taz. We are an independent training organisation that offers professional development to the UK civil service and the wider public sector. As you can see from this slide, we have delivered training to not just the central government departments such as Cabinet Office, DEFRA, DWP, but also devolved administrations like the Welsh Government and of course our NHS as well as local authorities. We also work with governments across the world. We had delegates from many locations, and from the next slide, we can see that we have delegates from the Far East, Africa, and also from America as well. We conduct over 70 different types of courses. You can see the different categories coming up on this slide, ranging from accountability and governance to finance and commercial skills. And today, as we are talking about behavioral change, this is taken from our full one-day course, Introduction to Behavioral Economics, that Taz teach. If you want to find out more about this course, drop us an email at the end of this webinar. On the next slide, we want to talk about our location. We are based in the heart of Westminster, right next to St. James's Park. We are opposite the Ministry of Justice. Parliament is roughly 10 minutes away from our office, and the Supreme Court is 5 minutes walk. Please do visit us once the lockdown is over. Last week, we ran a webinar on understanding the UK civil service. We talked about the structure and recent reforms. If you or your colleagues are interested, the webinar is now available on Civil Service College YouTube channel. Allow me to cover a few housekeeping notes before we start. Today's webinars will be recorded. We will email you the videos in a day or two. For your colleagues who are unable to join us today, please feel free to share the recording with them later on. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any of our webinars. Another housekeeping note, if you have a question for us, whether it is on tech issues or regarding this subject, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We were trying to keep this webinar as interactive as possible, so please do share your thoughts in the chat box. And if you're happy to share with everyone, please have your message sent to all panelists and attendees, otherwise only Taz and myself can see your comments. Today our topic is Nudging After Pandemic, Understanding Behavioral Change in a Time of Disruption. Behavioral economics has been around for some time, but the application of behavioral insights into public policy really took off in 2010 after David Cameron's government established the Nudge Unit within the Cabinet Office. Since then, we have seen successful cases where understanding behavior change has improved policy outcomes and impacts, and of course resulted in efficiency gain. In this pandemic, we have seen governments applied nudge theory in their fight against coronavirus. So what it will be like after the pandemic? What behavior change will we see as we're starting to adapt to the new normal? We are very pleased to have our expert trainer, Anthony Tasgal, with us. He actually prefers us to call him Taz rather than Anthony, hence I've been calling him Taz. Taz is a former ad agency planner and strategist. He has helped many clients in both public and private sectors. For example, currently he is helping the Royal Albert Hall to tell their story ahead of their 150th anniversary in 2021. Beside this, he is an associate lecturer at Bucks New University, Nottingham-Trent, and Beijing Normal Universities, and as a principal advisor to CIO Connect in Hong Kong. He speaks regularly at international conferences and on media channels to discuss marketing and advertising topics. He authors 3 books on storytelling, creativity, and insights. I do recommend everyone to check out his books on Amazon. So Tas, please tell us what you think about nudging after the pandemic.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, as it is here in the UK from everyone. I say good morning, it's a pretty glum, miserable morning, meteorologically as well as metaphorically. So yeah, I want to talk a bit about the theory of behavioural economics, some of the principles of it, and also just perhaps a few ideas about the way it's been used during the pandemic and the way it might be perhaps developed after we come out of whatever this is going to be, whenever this is going to be. So I'm going to try and divide the talk into sort of roughly 3 areas. Now, as many of you may know, there are many books, many articles about behavioural economics. And I actually spend, as Chris said, a day doing a training session for civil service college. I often do 2 whole days worth. So all I could be able to do in this is just give you a flavour of some of the principles. But as Chris said, I think on the chat, please at any point, do type in a question or a comment. Feel free to agree with anything I say violently. And either I'll stop as I'm talking or we can have questions at the end, because I'd like to make this as interactive as possible. Clearly with Zoom, it's a great system, but it's still not the same as being in a room with real people, looking at their eyes, seeing their body language, responding to questions. So it's great. At any point, please do make comments in the chat box. So let's kick off. Yeah, understanding behaviour change, which is something that the private sector and the public sector, as Chris has said, have probably been looking at only really for about 10 years, but it's suddenly taken off. And I think governments, departments, as well as the commercial sector, are still really sort of finding their way. And as I said, as somebody that comes from a sort of advertising planning background, I've always been fascinated about how to apply it to getting people to comply or understand or buy a product or a service or follow a certain behaviour. So that's going to be one of the threads that runs through the next 45 minutes. So just a brief introduction. Chris has sort of done most of that, so I won't dwell on it. I never quite know what to call myself, but I've called myself a man of many lanyards, since I have so many of them all over my house. As Chris said, this is the glorious Royal Albert Hall, and I'm helping them tell their story. So I'm doing some strategy and storytelling consultancy with them. I do an awful lot of training for research companies, both in understanding storytelling, applying behavioural economics, and also what I call incitement. How do you create insight? I lecture at these places. Chris has mentioned them. Today, obviously, I'm here representing the Civil Service College, but I have other hats on as well. And I still have a foot in the marketing and advertising agency world, because again, they are at the forefront of applying behavioural economics. Shameless plug, as Chris said, I've written 3 books, the 4th coming out hopefully next year. The first one was about how to apply storytelling to more effective presentations and to be more persuasive. This is a store in London called Foyles. Some of you may recognise the man on the left, so possibly my epitaph will be I was 3 books away from Vince Cable. The second book, this is at the London Tate Modern, a wonderful gallery museum. The Inspiratorium, which was about what is insight, what is inspiration. And as you can see, my book's there next to, on the left of Noam Chomsky. And some of you may know it's very hard to be on the left of Noam Chomsky. That's a political joke, by the way. If anyone, put that in the chat if you get that. Okay, that's a political joke. And this is the new book that's been out as an ebook for about a month now, because physical publication of books has been stalled, as you may guess. And this is really about expressions and words and language that I love, and where it comes from and how to use it. Because again, I think one of the things that we underestimate is the power of language. And I'll mention that a little bit today. So that's enough about me. If you like what I'm saying, that's my Twitter handle at Taswell Hill. If you don't like what I'm saying, at Piers Morgan. Good. Just a bit of it. It's a shame that I can't see anyone's faces or reactions. Just an introduction about why behavioural economics has sort of now achieved the prominence that it has. And I think part of the reason is coming, as I say, partly from a commercial background. There has been so many products, so many services, and so many things that governments are having to say to ensure compliance about don't speed, don't eat the wrong food, don't engage in antisocial behaviour. And one of the things we find is that many services, many new products, many government initiatives fail. So one of the reasons that I've been interested in this topic is perhaps there's something we can learn about why things fail. And a lot of it, I think, is what I call a crisis of homogenization. Too many products, too many services, too many government departments are telling us the same things or asking us to buy or do the same things that we already know. And as I'll talk about briefly, the brain basically, when it hears something like that, the brain ignores it and filters it out. So for me, one of the insights of behavioural economics is understanding how we can get through that issue of people ignoring you because you're just telling them stuff that they already know, or telling them to do things that they already know, or telling them to buy products that they already know. We're living in a world that I call DRIP. I'm a big fan of acronyms, particularly my own. DRIP stands for Data Rich Insight Pool. Again, anyone who's had to watch the government press briefings about COVID data, anyone who works in any environment will know that we have more data now than we've ever had in our history. But probably we've got less insight. There is not necessarily a consequence that says the more data you have, the more insight you have. So again, for me, behavioural economics is a source of insight. How can we see things differently? How can we reposition our services or our communications in a way that comes from the theory of behavioural economics and is likely to lead to more positive outcomes, to more of the behaviour change that we're seeking to engender? I'm going to mention this book, Nudge, obviously. Richard Thaler, I'm hoping some of you have read this. Please, I think we'll say at the end, there's some dates coming up if you're in the UK or even globally. I'm running a course on this soon. We talk a lot about Nudge. Obviously, it's one of the seminal books. And one of the things I say about behavioural economics is when I first started talking about this 15 to 20 years ago, it was a sort of slightly peripheral, edgy, slightly where does that come from set of principles. Now it's becoming more and more mainstream. So, for example, I think it was 2 years ago, Richard Thaler, one of the co-authors, won the Nobel Prize for Economics. Another aspect of it becoming mainstream, I think Chris mentioned or I mentioned, I also helped run a cinema in North London, which is the oldest continually running cinema in the UK. So I always put a film reference in to everything I do. So some of you may have heard of a film a couple of years ago called The Big Short, which was a film based on an analysis, a documentary, a book about the 2007-8 crash. And it was turned into a film with Steve Carell and Christian Bale. And it featured celebrities making strange appearances, explaining some of the economic and human background behind the crash. And one of those people who made an appearance in that film, next to the actress Selena Gomez, was the behavioural economist Richard Thaler. And everyone in the cinema that I was at in the Phoenix in North London was going, oh, look, that's Selena Gomez, the famous Disney actress. And I was the only person in the cinema saying, oh, look, that's Richard Thaler, the famous professor of behavioural economics. So I actually wrote a tweet saying how wonderful the film was. And blow me down, I actually got a tweet from him. So again, this is probably, my life has been pretty much one sort of descent after this tweet, because I got a tweet from somebody who subsequently won a Nobel Prize. So, but my point is simple, which is behavioural economics used to be considered, as I say, slightly on the edge, but now it's absolutely core to how we look at behaviour change, communications, and all forms of understanding how to influence behaviour. In storytelling, which is my other hat, we always talk about the magic number 3. There's something powerful and innate about number 3. So 3 wise men, 3 blind mice, veni vidi vici, liberté, égalité, fraternité, etc. So I'm going to follow that principle. So I'm going to divide the next half an hour or so into 3 parts. Firstly, a bit about the theory. Why is it so disruptive? How has behavioural economics sort of come along and changed and upset an awful lot of assumptions about how human behaviour works and how therefore we can understand and influence it? Then, because of time, I think I'm going to take you through, 3 principles briefly. On the day, we go through 12. So if you like these 3, come along and learn about the other 9. And then I'm going to look at some specific ideas and examples that have been used in the pandemic and see how it's perhaps been adapted and what we might learn when, I say when, rather than if, we come out the other side of the pandemic. Because I think it's a bit early. I've seen some examples, our country, the UK, Brazil, Ukraine, have used some of these principles. And I think it's fascinating to see what's worked, what hasn't perhaps worked, and how, again, we can learn from that in the future. Again, I'm going to stop now because there's 3 sections coming up. Any questions, please type them in. But I'm going to start off with, as I say, why has behavioural economics sort of suddenly now, the last perhaps 5 years, attained the level of importance that it has? Why has it become so disruptive and essential? I think the proper function of marketing or communications is turning human understanding into business advantage. Whatever that business might be, whether it's public sector, private sector, whether it's behavioural change, behavioural adoption, buying products. So for me, anything that helps us understand human beings individually, collectively, tribally, has got to be a good thing. And for me, behavioural economics has an enormous plethora, a huge well of insights which make you see human behaviour in a new light. And again, I think I did a session at the end of last year, which was 2.5 days worth of behavioural economics. So trust me, there's a lot of stuff. So it's really about bringing this new understanding of human behaviour to light and applying it. I wish I'd said this. If anyone wants to just like put a little clap or applaud here, please do. This was said by a man called David Eagleman, who's a neuroscientist from Texas, very bright and annoyingly handsome. And one of his books, Incognito, he says, we don't think the way we think we think. And again, I absolutely love that, because I think it's a beautiful expression, because we tend to think, or we like to think, that we or people out there, consumers, humans, the public, think in a certain way, that they think rationally and logically in a considered manner, that they almost like go in a sequence, this, then this, then this, then this, and therefore I conclude. And one of the key insights of neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, behavioural economics, call it what you will, is that doesn't seem to be the case, or at least it's the case much more rarely than we like to admit. Yes, it does happen. People do make purely rational decisions, but it seems to be much more of an exception than the rule. So where does that lead us from that insight? Now, again, there may be some classical economists here. I come in peace. Let me just say that now. Star Trek. But I do want to just give you a different, perhaps, perspective on the way that classical economics tends to view human behaviour. And again, I'm a classicist. I didn't mention that. I come from a background where I read Homer, not the yellow one, and Virgil. So I'm not an economist. But from the way that behavioural economists talk about classical economics, there is a sort of theory that perhaps classical economics sees human behaviour like this. Human beings are predominantly rational, they act consistently, the choices are rational, and therefore any messaging that governments or companies make should be primarily rational. And that the model that we're using is one of conscious persuasion. People only will change their behaviour if they're conscious of what it is that they're being told, and that is persuasive in a sort of rational manner. And again, a bit of language that I always liked, which any economists out there will hopefully be aware of, is they tend to think of human beings as maximising their utility. Now, I don't know about you, it's about 10 to 11 here, but I didn't wake up today deciding that I was going to maximise my utility. It's not only a strange bit of language, but what it really means is that human beings will always go out of their way to make the best possible decision they can. Which isn't the case. Again, this is what we find. It doesn't seem to be, it might seem bizarre and irrational, but we don't actually often go out and make the best possible choice. As we will see, other factors get in the way, other biases get in the way. So behavioural economics questions this model, this homo economicus model, the idea that human beings behave in the way that economists think they do, or at least like to think that they do. And once you start looking at that model and saying, hang on, that doesn't seem to work, all sorts of other things fall out. And that's what I want to continue to talk about. Again, if you come along, I will go through all these books. Some of you probably read or heard of Nudge. Many of you have probably heard of Daniel Kahneman. I don't think there's time. If you want to ask me, I had a conversation with him. He's a very lovely man. Thinking Fast and Slow. Please, it's a great book. It's too long, needed editing. On the day, I will talk about the paradox of choice, predictably irrational, etc. But not in this session. There's just not enough time. But I do want to talk about something that our beloved UK Cabinet Office put out a few years ago. They wrote a document called Mindspace, which was beginning to explore all this emerging theory. And I found this paragraph in that document, and I was quite stunned, quite taken aback by it. Because given that presumably lawyers and other legal folk had to pore over this document, what this paragraph was actually saying, all of this theory, let's call it behavioural economics, shifts the focus of attention away from facts and information. The government admitting, and please don't quote me on this because I'd like to keep working with the civil service, but this is the government sort of unconsciously admitting that communicating solely with facts and information doesn't seem to work, or if it does, it doesn't work as well as it used to, and that we need to move to a new model, which is more about changing context and understanding other factors. And when I looked at that, I went, wow, okay, the government gets it. The government understands Nudge, understands Kahneman, understands Schwartz, etc. And they realized that focusing solely on facts and information isn't enough, which for me was a sort of, yes, they finally got it. Because if there's one thing that I have to say an awful lot to companies and government offices and departments I work with, is please stop just transmitting facts. It's not enough. And in the next sort of, as I say, 10, 20 minutes, I'll explain why. I'm hoping that most of you have come to this seminar, to this webinar, have sort of come on the basis that you're expecting to hear this sort of exposition, because that is something that I do find is a real assumption and prejudice in a lot of people I work with, that we are in the business of giving people facts. And all I'm saying is that is not enough. I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just saying it's not enough. Why? Because the brain is often considered to be like a sponge or a computer. That isn't the case. Again, if you want to ask me later and there's time, I'll explain why. I like to think of the brain as an ignoring machine. Our brain is designed not to absorb everything and keep everything, but actually to reject most of what it takes in. The brain is an incredibly energy-hungry organ. The brain roughly accounts for 1.5% to 2% of our body weight, but needs 20 to 25% of the energy that we take in. So the brain is always doing something that is energy efficient. Doesn't always have to be right or best. And equally, we know from the brain that 90 to 95%, no one really knows, of our decision-making isn't conscious or rational. It's pre-conscious, automatic and intuitive. Now think about that. That's not 10, 20, 90 to 95% of all the decisions that we make. And they may be small as well as big, obviously. So this sort of sets up all the biases and preconceptions that allow us to say that we are not as rational as we like to think, or as rational as we think economists think. I don't know if anyone's viewing this from France. I haven't done any work in France for a while. I speak French, I love French, but I was doing some work for a company called Peugeot, car manufacturer, many years ago. And on someone's door in Paris, I saw this written, Le rationnel est l'alibi de désir. The rational is the alibi of desire. I love that. Everything sounds better in French though, doesn't it? But bear that in mind. It's a beautiful expression. So any of you who work in communications or influence behavior change, that's your job. Your job is creating alibis for desire. Again, that may be shocking, it may be disruptive, but I'm sorry, I think that's what falls out of behavioural economics' principles. I mentioned, I think briefly, I'm a lapsed classicist. I don't know, can I put this in the chat box if anyone's there? Anyone know which famous dead Greek philosopher said this? If anyone wants to write it in the chat, you can. While you do, I'm going to have a sip of my Earl Grey tea. Famous dead Greek philosopher. You've got about 3 choices. Can't see anyone saying anything. Maybe you're just being too cautious. Can you see anything, Chris? No, I can't see anything on the chat.
Not yet. Oh, yeah. One person.
No, it's not. One of the famous, there are probably 3 famous Greek philosophers that people know. I'll give you a clue. It's not Plato or Socrates. It's not Plato. Thanks, John.
Yeah.
The other one, Aristotle.
Yeah.
Correct. There you go. There he is. There's Aristotle. Aristotle in Greek said, logikon zoon, a rational animal. And everyone went, brilliant, because he was not only a philosopher, he was a natural scientist, a thinker, all sorts of things, a lawyer. And what he said was logikon zoon, a rational animal. And everyone said, that's brilliant. We know human beings were actually rational. But he said zoon, an animal. Zoon as in the Greek word zoo. And that's the thing we must never forget in human behaviour. Yes, we may be rational, but we are still animals. We still have animal instincts and animal drives. An author called Cordelia Fine wrote a brilliant book called A Mind of Its Own about the brain. The brain has a mind of its own, which is a lovely expression. And she says we have this preferred view. It's wrong. We have a preferred view of ourselves that we are free, rational, decisive, and individual. And in varying degrees, those are all wrong, or at least they're not right all the time. We're much less free, much less rational. We're much less able to make decisions when we say we're making decisions. And also we're much less individualistic than we like to think. At this point, I usually bring in the famous Star Trek analogy. This probably dates me because this is the original William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy. Mr. Spock on the right and Captain Kirk on the left. And we often like to think that we're Mr. Spock, that everything is logical, Captain. But actually, most of the time, we're more like Captain Kirk. We actually think about things, but then we go with our emotions. We go with our guts. Anyone who doesn't know, perhaps Star Trek, this is perhaps a better example of Mr. Spock, Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory. Okay, most of us are not like Sheldon. I don't know you all yet, maybe you are, but as a general rule, human beings probably not like Sheldon. And some of you may have heard of the System 1, System 2 analogy, which again, Kahneman talks about. He adopted it from a man called Stanovich. The idea is that we have two brain processes which are going on all the time without us knowing. One is System 2, I'm going to start off with 2, which is rational, which is more conscious, which is slightly more thoughtful and slightly more considered. But number 1 is the bigger one. That's why it's in a bigger bubble. And it happens automatically, unconsciously, intuitively. We have very little idea what is going on in System 1. Freud was half right. He was half right that we have an unconscious, but he was wrong about what's going on. It wasn't to do with strange Greek myths. What is going on is all the things that make us who we are, our traits, our character, our dispositions, our biases, live in System 1. And there are 2 things about that you need to know. One is that most of, as I say, who we are happens in System 1. And 2, we have very little direct access to System 1. System 2 can only guess most of the time at what System 1 really says or wants or does, which is why we have this constant, I do an awful lot of market research, for example. We have this constant tension between what people say they do and what they actually do. So when you ask people in research, you tend to get a System 2 response. You know, are you going to actually reduce the amount of cigarettes you smoke? Or are you going to wash your hands more often? Oh, yes, of course I am. System 2. It's much harder to get System 1. And System 1 is in control. I did say it was disruptive. Kahneman also talks about the fact we are cognitive misers. Again, as I mentioned before, because our brain is energy efficient, it's in our brain's interest to go for things which are energy efficient solutions and answers. A word that's often used by particularly people like me who apply behavioural economics is effortlessness. If you want people to adopt a behaviour, you have to make it as effortless as possible. Again, when we get to section 3, I'll show you some examples of the way that people have adopted some of these principles during the pandemic to make behaviour change slightly more effortless. Because if we're cognitive misers, it's not in our brain's interest to have to go through lots of cognitive processing to do something or learn new behaviour. So end of part 1, that's the theory. I'm just going to give you 3 key principles, and then the third part we'll talk about some examples from the pandemic and what we can learn. This may look a bit overwhelming, it's meant to. These are the 12 principles that I talk about on the day. So again, if any of you are interested, please come along and I'll talk about all of these 12 principles throughout the day. But these are 3 I'm just going to pick out because they sort of relate to what I want to talk about in the next section. So I'll talk about the importance of emotion and why emotion is absolutely key to getting people's attention, to changing their behaviour, and to making people feel involved in a new policy or a new principle of behavioural policy, behavioural change. I'll go back to the point about System 1 and System 2, because again, that is absolutely core to understanding how to apply behavioural economics and how to really understand how human beings think and behave. And I've decided to pick on, because of the whole thing about the pandemic encouraging social norms, I thought it would be a good idea to look a little bit at that principle as well. So those are the 3 things I'm going to talk about in this section. Point 1, principle 1, you've got to lead with emotion. Not just sort of include it as an afterthought, but lead with emotion. Because if you lead with something that gets into the emotions, it's more likely to grab attention. It's one of the things that we learn, not just from the theory, but all the practice and principles and advertising campaigns that have used behavioural economics. They use emotions up front. I'll go on past that. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of this. So this is something I worked on years ago with the British Heart Foundation in the UK. This is about encouraging a particular target group to cut down on the amount of cigarettes that they consumed. Again, I'll try my luck on the chat here. Anyone guess which group this was aimed at? You can't just say smoke. It's a bit more narrow. Which demographic or which sort of group subset of smokers do you think this was aimed at? I've still got Aristotle up there, which is not the right answer. So. Old people. Kevin L. Good suggestion. I'm not saying it's right. Over 50s. No, yeah, brilliant. Lindsay Clark. If I could see your wave at you, I would say well done. Can I do? I don't know if I can do the little. Have I got the little clap thing? I don't know. Clapping hands now. Well done, Lindsay. Yeah, this was aimed, and Kosu as well. This was aimed at younger women. This was aimed at teenage girls who were at the time very, very high smokers. They were taking on smoking in the way that sort of boys had perhaps 10, 20, 30 years ago. The idea being here, this is about saying to teenage girls who are worried about their shape or their figure or their weight, smoking isn't just bad for you, it makes you fat. Now, again, if you want to ask me about ethics, we can talk about ethics, but we'll be here for another 3 hours. But we found this was a really powerful way of saying to this particular demographic, this particular audience, not about cancer, not about lung disease, not about it'll take 5 years off your life when you're 70, because when you're 15, who cares? It's about something that's very, very immediate and very emotional and absolutely targeted at System 1. This is actually evoking the feeling of disgust. That's the emotion that we aimed for here. I'll give you another example, I think, of disgust. Some of you may know the classic sort of antibacterial spray ad. Kills 99% of all known germs. So you'll see generally like a mother and a child, and there'll be a table, a glass table, and there's always someone doing a semicircular swipe. I don't know why it was always semicircular. This is an ad that one of my students sent me, I think from Thailand, which is a completely different advertising approach. If you want to write your comments on the chat on that, please do. Okay, maybe it's just me. But the idea that that is designed to make you go, and that's interesting again. This was a few years old, but actually in the pandemic, I think that's quite a topical ad. It's saying rather than just showing another example of a spray on a table, your brain filters it out because it says, oh, no, I've seen that 100 times. First of all, this goes for disgust. It says every time you go out, you don't know what you're touching. Oh, God, you're touching other people's fingers. And it's absolutely impossible to ignore that image. There's almost no facts in that campaign because you don't need them. Your brain, System 1, goes, oh, why am I feeling that? And then it decodes why you're feeling that as disgust, as saying, oh, so that means every time I go out, I'm touching other people's germs. So the brand at the moment is actually a hand gel. But the idea is the same thing. It's about disinfectant and cleaning your hands, which again, I think I would like to have seen something more like that in the pandemic. And I'll give you one example later. Rather than just very rational, very factual, wash your hands, keep away from people. So again, it's about evoking emotions. Yuck. Thank you, Kostu. Gruesome. Gruesome, that's a good word. I like the word gruesome. You say gruesome. Leanne, thank you for gruesome. I've now got a chat that says Aristotle, teens, and gruesome, which is it's like a random quiz. Good. I mentioned System 2 and System 1, and I want to come back to this because it is absolutely core to the whole behavioural economics enterprise. So just briefly, what's the difference? System 2 is our conscious brain processes. It tends to be much more of one system. It's more about sort of looking at checks and balances, and it's a little bit more about the future. It's a little bit more about the longer term view. But here's the thing I mentioned before. System 1, which is called the adaptive unconscious. Adaptive because it is how evolution makes us survive and thrive. That's what we are there to do. The whole sort of Dawkins neo-Darwin synthesis says that our genes are there to make sure they get passed on to the next generation. All the genes want us to do is to survive long enough to reproduce and carry on the genes. So our emotions are there to make sure that we don't die, that we don't exit the gene pool before we have passed our genes on. So the emotions are there to make sure, crucially, that we don't do anything stupid and that we do things that, as I say, enhance our chance of reproductive success. So System 1 is always looking for patterns. It's absolutely focused on the here and now. It's not thinking about the future. Again, this is why so much behaviour change is wrong, because by and large, if you talk to System 2 about the future, it turns off, because System 1 is only interested in now, keeping me alive now, making me happy now, keeping away predators now. But it also means that our brain System 1 process can be automatic, rigid, and precocious. Again, one of the principles that I haven't got time to talk about now, but I talk about on the day, are what are called heuristics, shortcuts. And they live in our automatic System 1. They're shortcuts that our brain makes all the time to save time and energy. But what it means is that sometimes we find ourselves doing things automatically that we don't even know we're doing. Again, the story I often tell was years ago when I was working full-time in agencies, ad agencies in London. I had to go into the office. Do you remember the office, people? An office was a place that we used to go to work to. I had to go into work. I would drive to, in North London, a station called Finsbury Park. I would park at Finsbury Park Station, get the train, the Piccadilly line to Leicester Square. And I remember one morning getting up, feeling slightly tired. I was quite young, whatever. Getting up, getting in the car, thinking, I don't want to do this. And then 5 minutes away, I'm just about to park, and I realise it's Saturday. Because often that's what we do. Our brain just has these heuristics, has these shortcuts, and it will do things. And we find ourselves sometimes, don't we, being caught out. We find ourselves doing things that we realise, why am I here? What am I? And it's because your System 1 is just rolling these scripts, rolling these shortcuts. And as I said earlier, the important thing to know is that System 1 is in control. However much you think your System 2, what's concentrating on what I'm saying now, hopefully, is in control, most of the time it isn't. Most of the time, the operating system, I don't like using that, but the main thing that is running who we are and what we are is in System 1. It's why we know so little about who we are very often. Often if you ask yourself how you ended up with someone you've ended up with, or why you end up buying a flat, or sometimes it's very hard to know, actually, how that actually happened. And that's because System 1 harbours all that information, and very often we don't have access to it. And my third one is really the fact that we like to think we're individuals. I'm a big Monty Python fan. Hopefully most of you are. Some of you may have seen The Life of Brian. There's a great scene where Brian, who everyone thinks is the Messiah, comes out and he says, "Stop following me, I'm not the Messiah." And he says to them all, "You're all individuals." And someone puts their hand up and says, "I'm not." We like to think we're individuals, but actually most of us, we're not. Most of us follow a crowd. We belong to a tribe. We conform. And again, in the day, there's a whole section about the power of conformity, the power of compliance. We are herd animals. We are social animals. So I'll give you a couple of examples of this. This is from an American thinker. Even when we are free to do what we want, we still end up imitating other people. I mean, if you take away people like, I don't know, Lady Gaga maybe, there are relatively few people who are completely idiosyncratically individual. Most of us tend to follow a group. In fact, in the day, I often ask a question rhetorically: why do people go to Waitrose? which is a sort of upmarket retail food store in the UK? The answer, because other people like them go to Waitrose. Fashion works entirely, I lecture, as Chris said, at Nottingham Trent. I work on their fashion marketing course. And one of the things that fashion is all about is about creating groups and tribes. Because by and large, people like to think they're individuals, but they're actually just another goth, or they're just another whatever, because we fit ourselves into tribes. And again, I think that is one of the key learnings that we found from the pandemic, and I'm coming on to that next. This is one of my favourite examples of following the tribe. I'll just have a cup of water while I let you enjoy that one. Any comments on that one? I like that. I think that's that. Who's the one that you really appreciate? The guy on the left or the person on the right? You love the lights. Oh, okay, Leanne. Okay, you might. I do love the lights. But I think the person that, yeah, the person on the right's the smart one, isn't it? Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Kossi. Because you just think they've done all the person on the left's done all the effort. The person on the right, you go, yeah, that's great. And again, I like that approach. And again, it just reminds us how powerful these things are. I mentioned a famous experiment. There are many I do on the day, but just because of time, I'm not doing it now. A man called Solomon Asch did this experiment in 1958. And again, two conditions. Condition one, the person in the middle is asked, there is a line on the left, which of the lines on the right is the same length? Very simple question. If you ask people on their own, 95% of people will say A, because it's obviously A. Here's the clever thing he did. If he surrounds the subject with 4 other people who are what are called stooges, they're in on the experiment, and they are told to say B, guess what happens? 2/3 of people will say, you know what, actually maybe it's B, yeah, I think it might be, yeah, it's probably B. Where it patently isn't. You can see the evidence in front of your eyes. The point is, as it says in the box, we often will go against what we know or what we see or the evidence of our eyes in order to comply. In order to comply. Yeah, somebody said about the preacher, it's cheaper. That's also a very good point. You have to go through the effort, not only the cognitive effort, but the financial effort of doing all of that. So this is a really great point as well. We are incredibly good, again, often without knowing, at falling into order, falling in with other people because we want to fit in and comply. Again, this is what I'm going to talk about in the last section, which is now. So what I've done is I've collected a few examples that I've seen and picked up over the last few months of the pandemic, and then some sort of overall thoughts and conclusions about where we might be coming out of that and where we might be able to apply some of those areas, and perhaps even 1 or 2 areas that haven't been thought about. So these are some examples. I don't know if you've seen any of them, but they're ones that I picked up on and feel quite strongly about. So the first thing is, we talked about social norms and herds. Now, I don't want to get into the politics of this, so I'm going to try and look at it just purely from a behavioural economics communication point. This was incredibly effective because it created a social norm. Social norm, which is, we are now going to have to change behaviour from doing what we did to doing this. If we stay at home in the UK, we will protect the NHS and save lives. Very clear, very direct. Actually, you could argue very system 2, because it's very rational. But it was incredibly powerful as a social norm. Fit in, comply. The idea, if people don't fit in, they are defectors, as it's called in the trade, and defectors are punished. So it's very important that the government tried to do this. I think once they moved away and moved to stay alert, I think that changed it. I think it was far less powerful. But this was absolutely bang on applying social norms. Not again saying what's right, but just sort of saying if we just together as a community, as a tribe, as a group, we will all succeed. So I thought that was incredibly effective. So again, this is a comment I read from somebody's acknowledgement of that these are social norms, as I said, social norms, and about social proof and peer pressure. Again, I think sometimes government policy as well as commercial organisations spends too much time talking to people as if they're individuals, rather than trying to, as I say, create a social norm or a social proof. Social proof is the more people do X, the more likely you are to do X. Whether X is good or bad, whether it's weight or driving, All it says is social proof is incredibly important. So these, as it says, lands changes in behaviour. Very effective, very powerful. The second thing is, we're all told to wash our hands for 20 seconds. And very dull, very boring. Oh God, why have I got to do it? Ugh. This particular woman, I thought, did it really well. We were told, rather than just saying 20 seconds, it's twice the time it takes to sing happy birthday to you, which again is a bit more fun. What she did was, as you can see in her bathroom, she put pictures of happy birthday balloons next to all the hand sanitizers. So it doesn't just have to be factual and rational, it can be fun. Saliency is a word that we use in the advertising business to make it prominent, to make it impactful. So firstly, it's a fun thing to do. And again, I suspect most of you are hopefully looking at this and thinking, yes, that's quite sweet. But it was a way of reminding her. So again, rather than having, I don't know, a way of thinking every time I wash my hands, every time she goes into the bathroom, it's there. Very system one approach. So the facts are there, you know, wash your hands, do it. But making something a happy birthday and fun. I like that. I thought it was a really sweet, powerful thing to do. Again, another company did this, this is before the pandemic. This was about encouraging children to wash hands in the developing world. And what they did was surprise soap. Actually, what happens was if you use the soap after a while, when you start washing it, there's a little gift or a toy in there. Again, it's about giving people fun and rewards. So this was about encouraging children who perhaps don't, you know, wash their hands often enough. The more they wash their hands, the quicker they get to a reward. Again, that's absolutely bang on what behavioural economics is saying. Rather than just saying, you must wash your hands, it's good for you, it will, you know, which again, it's very easy for the brain to go, yeah, I know. A very clever, sweet, rewarding way of doing it. Again, just because of time, I'm going to move on quickly in this. The behavioural insights team in the UK looked at what's the best way of conveying information. I shouldn't have to say this, but I'm saying it anyway, which is it's important to have things which are visual demonstrations. Too often, again, we have communication which is just verbal, factual, rational system too. The more you can supplement it with visual graphics, which just do this really quickly. Again, it's not creative, it's not, you know, extravagantly, you know, left field, but it's just a simple way of using an infographic with text. And again, this was an experiment they actually carried out to look at the effect. This is something I live where I live in North London. I don't live in Hackney, but Haringey, but this is what I found. This was about 2 meter social distancing. Now, there's nothing wrong with that poster. But anyone who works in the creative industry and who knows the power of system one and showing says that 2 meter thing doesn't really work because it's just saying you need to keep away from 2 meters. How better is it to do that? Why not show people that's 2 meters? You don't need all the other copy because everyone in the UK knows that. Nobody knows about 2 meters. But show people what 2 meters looks like. Because the issue isn't that they aren't distancing, it's that people don't actually know how 2 meters is. Most people think it's about, you ask people to do it and they'll say actually it's quite a distance. So what somebody did, this isn't Hackney, this is actually a creative person that I know, just did this, mocked it up and put them up everywhere. Because that shows people actually with system one, and also it's acting on surprise, the emotion of surprise. Again, in the day I talk about the six big emotions. Happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, disgust. We talked about disgust. This is surprise. The next one is how do you make it desirable? How do you make hand washing desirable? Again, it's not a very exciting behaviour. So again, this is someone who suggested, well, why not get companies who are doing it in their offices to use really nice soaps? Make the soaps desirable. Don't just make them like boring, hygienic, you know, make them beautiful, make them sensual, make it rewarding. Rewarding is the word I keep coming back to again and again as one of the key things behavioural economics talks about, as well as being easy, as well as making it timely. I think one of the government acronyms is EAST, and they talk about satisfying. I use the word rewarding. I think rewarding is a better word. If you can make behaviour rewarding, it's more likely to be followed. And again, this is something I really love. I came across this, I think it was, again, somebody who did it just to himself. Rather than saying to people, be careful about touching handles and doors and things, because they may carry germs, why not just put these little stickers on them? Great. It's so simple, not just for children, but for everyone, because it gives you a visual, immediate reminder to system one. Oh, that's a handle. Look, there's germs and bugs. Because again, system one, where all the heuristics are basically, it's okay to touch everything because that's what we've done for 20, 30, 40 years. This makes us stop in our tracks because it appeals to that visual sense of surprise and disgust. Again, really simple, really tiny, but effective. And those are things I think we should be applying more, not just in the pandemic, but beyond the pandemic when we come out and we start, again, engendering behaviour change. And this is possibly my favourite example. This is from Ukraine. It's the Ukraine Ministry of Culture and Information. And I think I've got 3 of them here. There's a few of them. This is brilliant. They've just said, okay, we're going to use famous artworks. I mean, it's just brilliant, but it's so arresting. It grabs your attention. So this is about using food delivery services. The next one is obviously the Sistine Chapel, about hand sanitizer. And this one is Magritte, famous Belgian. I love Magritte work. And again, it's just, yeah. I can't see all your faces, but I'm put your comments in the chat. Whenever I see this, it makes me smile, it makes me warm, but actually I remember it. And one of the things I haven't had time to talk about because we're running out of time is one of the key things about any form of communication about anything, let alone behaviour change, is it's got to be memorable. Yeah, thank you, Joe Penhaligon. I love them too. It's memorable, and these are memorable, and 90% of communication isn't. So for me, as I say, because I come from a sort of advertising background, I'm always looking at ways of using behavioural economics in a way that is graphic and memorable and visual and emotional, which isn't behavioural economics, but it's the best, or one of the best applications of them. And this is actually, I think, from Brazil. And there's something, again, it's beautifully graphic and visual. Now, we didn't really go in for this in the UK. It's the remembering the message, emotional response. Absolutely. Again, I just like this idea. It's very disruptive, strange, challenging, visual. And yes, there's facts in there. There's system 2 facts, wash them with soap and water to keep bacteria at bay. But I just like the fact the eyes, again, we're all, the human brain is predisposed to look at eyes. We're very good at looking at eyes. This is, I think, possibly my last point. I like the idea, I think, came from one's from Britain, one's from Canada. I talk an awful lot of storytelling. This is more of a storytelling thing than behavioural economics. The idea of who are heroes, and we talked an awful lot in the UK about the NHS and care workers. But the idea is, what does it mean to be a hero? And storytelling is all about heroes and villains and conflicts and quests. And I like the idea, be a hero, don't leave the house, or be a hero, be boring. And the one on the right is beautiful because it's got such a clever image. If you look at it, it's a superhero mask, but also someone lying down. Very visual, very system 1, but it grabs your attention, and then system 2 goes, why am I, oh, isn't that clever? That's telling me. So I think this is my last summary slide, and then I'll take any questions if you have them. So the first thing is, I'm a big fan of language. The 3rd book in Citations is all about language and expressions and acronyms. It's incredibly powerful. As I say, I think the original stay-at-home Protect the NHS wasn't particularly graphic language, but it was very clear and very simple. Stay alert, I think, wasn't. I think it was too late. But the first point is, don't rely solely on facts. I'm not saying don't use facts, but you cannot rely solely on facts. Otherwise, you end up with this sort of a didactic lecturing, like you're talking down to people, pointing a finger at them, telling them what's good. Be more visual. Again, I think that's the pandemic stuff I've seen that works best is much more visual, much more graphic. I'd like to see, when we come out of the pandemic, behaviour being encouraged in a way that is more visual. Certainly employ the gamut of emotions. If there's anything that we should learn from this, it's that emotions are incredibly powerful. Again, not just in terms of changing behaviour, but in terms of how we think, in terms of changing our echo chambers and thought bubbles. Emotions have to cut through. There's so many contrasting facts. The fourth point is fun. As I say, I talk a lot in the day about using fun and playfulness. I think there's a tendency sometimes to think that, pandemics, diseases, behaviour change, smoking, health are very serious, which they are. And then we must only be serious in terms of addressing them. I don't think that's true. I think we can do things which are fun and lively and playful. And often they're not just acceptable, they are effective. They're really, really effective. Heuristics, as I say, I haven't really had time to talk about them, they're shortcuts. If you can make a behaviour something that is a shortcut and automatic and quick and easy, the brain will do it and not even think about it anymore. Slightly more complicated, like 45 minutes, but it's worth bearing in mind. I love the fact that, as I say, where governments have tried to create and reinforce social norms, it works. Why? Because you're talking about the tribe, you're talking about tribe values, you're bringing people together around a norm, a behaviour, a belief. You're punishing people that don't adhere to that belief. Rather than pointing at people individually, you need to lose weight. You need to stop smoking. Which it's easy for us to say, no, I don't care what you think, I'm going to go and do it anyway. And my last point, which is, as I say, really storytelling, which is understand the nature of heroism and villainy. If you can create a conflict, how do you become a hero? How do you punish the villain? What is conflict about? All stories have a conflict in them. And clearly the pandemic has created lots of conflicts. So try and characterize those conflicts in a story. I think I've come to the end. There's plenty more where that came from. But I think for the moment, that's all I've got. If there are any questions in chat, I'm very happy to take them. Thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you very much, Tas. Certainly, that's a very insightful webinars you delivered. So any questions for Tas, please use the Q&A function or just leave your comments in the chat box. I do have one question for you, Tas. You said it's very important to use visuals and graphics, and you used the Hackney's 2 meters example. Have you seen any examples of behavioral economics application through videos? As you can see now, a lot of the social media content that we have access to are videos. Have you seen any good examples that you can share with us?
Yeah, I can. In the day, I go through various examples of film clips, of government, public sector, private sector examples, of people talking about sort of visual gamification or playfulness. So I'll give you one example which I talk about, which is some steps in a tube station, in a train station in Stockholm years ago. What they did was they tried to get people to use steps rather than using the escalator. So they set up an exercise. They set up an exercise where they actually painted piano keys on the steps. And they actually made it, I don't know how they do this because I'm not musical or technical. They made it so when you press on each step, it creates a note, a musical note. And what they found is if they just left it there, people would walk on the steps to make a sound, to make like a musical song. People would do it individually or with their dog or with their boyfriend or girlfriend. Now, that was encouraging people to use steps rather than go on escalator as a way of, burning weight and keeping fit. Beautiful visual way of doing it. Not just visual, sensual way of doing it. And again, if you think about what it would have been them putting up posters saying, oh, well, you must use the steps because, you'll lose weight and you'll keep fit. And system 2 goes, yeah, I know, boring, stop telling me what to do. But this doesn't do that. It just gets you at a sort of unconscious fun level. And you play it, and I've done it myself. And it's just, because it makes a song. Also, in Japan, they had sort of musical roadways. There was a couple of paths of a motorway where if you go at precisely the recommended speed of like 27 miles an hour, it plays, there are indentations on the road. It plays a tune, So if you go above 30 miles an hour, you don't get the song. But if you go exactly the right speed, it plays a tune. Now, how brilliant is that? It doesn't say, slow down, don't speed, you'll kill people. Very system 2. It gives you a sort of fun, playful, musical System 1 reward. There's loads more examples. I think those are fantastic things, but they're still seen as a little bit, it's a bit left field, but they're incredibly effective. Thank you, Johnny F, by the way. Thank you.
That's very creative. And I think you can spend a lot of time just kind of explaining that it's not just the visual, it's also other senses like our audio and the listening to music that could really help people to change their behavior. Earlier you talked about social norms is very important, and how understanding it could help shaping people's behavior. What can we do to understand social norms that are often complex and multifaceted?
I think I lost the last question, sorry.
Yeah, what can
you faded about social norms?
Yeah, the social norms are often very complex, multifaceted. So how can a policymaker really understand how complex the social norms is and choose what is relevant to build up that solutions?
Yeah, no, it's a big and deep question. When I work with the public sector or private sector, it's important to say, okay, rather than, I'll give you an example. Okay, so a few years ago, I was working with what was quaintly called then the Labour government. And I was working with an agency, and we were asked to look at devising an anti-bullying policy. This was about 10 years ago, maybe now. And before that, it was all, don't be a bully, it's bad, it's antisocial, you're a horrible person. And we looked at it, but we looked at some research, particularly from the US. And what they had done is they used social norms. And they said, actually, how many people do you think carry out bullying in this school or in this university or in society? And people would say, I don't know, 5, 10, 20%. The figure was actually about 0.5%. It's tiny. So they did this campaign that said, hardly anyone bullies. Why should you? So it was creating the norm, saying actually bullying is actually quite rare. So actually there's no need. It was a really completely different way of doing it. Rather than saying don't do it, it's horrible, it's violent, it's whatever. It just said actually it's quite rare. It doesn't really happen that much. And that plays into something that's called broken windows theory, which Malcolm Gladwell talks about. So in the States in the 70s in New York, there was terrible violence and terrible destruction, terrible antisocial behavior. And they tried more policing, they tried more laws and harsher penalties. But what they found, the best thing to do was clear up all the smashed windows and get rid of the graffiti. Because when all the windows were smashed and things were broken and there was graffiti, it encourages people to say, look at the chaos. It doesn't matter what you do. Whereas if you clean it all up, the norm is actually, oh, that looks fine, I'm not going to destroy it. So sometimes the social norm thing is quite subtle, and it's completely different to what most communication agencies and ad agencies do. They're very keen on pointing fingers and doing attitude changing. But social norm, finding something you can get people to rally around and say, yes, we all do that. We all believe bullying is bad, and therefore we won't do it. Sometimes can be a completely different way of doing that sort of a campaign, rather than, as I say, just doing this finger pointing stuff.
Yeah. Thank you, Taz. I'm just mindful that we have overrun by 3 minutes, and actually some of our attendees has to leave. So I'm just gonna, if it's okay, Taz, just allow me to ask one more question before we wrap up. I know you've got a very important celebration today, so I don't want to keep holding you back.
My wedding anniversary.
Yeah, it's Taz's wedding anniversary, so I can't keep him here for too long. Earlier talks about we need, it's not necessarily about facts. We have seen examples that you have shown in your presentation that is about triggering emotion. You don't need to address facts, like the Thai advert that you shown us. There's nothing about facts in that advert.
Yes.
Should we be worried that people are using this other emotional approach to generate fake news and giving misleading information to people?
Ooh. How long have we got?
Just it's 2 minutes.
Okay,
it's a very, very deep question.
It's a massive question. This cuts across with my main interests, so storytelling and behavioural economics. And again, I think one of the things that we find, and I talk about a lot, which overlaps both, which is really, who's that? So thank you for the wedding anniversary. Thank you, Leanne. Thank you. It cuts across both of those things, because we know that if you get people's emotions involved and you tell them a story, it's more likely to get their emotions involved and more likely to get into their heads. Now, in storytelling, we talk about the narrative fallacy, which is that we are so influenced by storytelling that often we will listen to a story even if it's not true. And you're absolutely right, with the rise of sort of fake news and non-mainstream media, they've understood that. I'll leave with one other point. There's a man called Drew Weston who wrote a book about politics and neuroscience, the name of which just escapes me at the moment. American Democrat researcher and thinker. And he basically said that if you look at the politics, the right wing tends to use much more emotion. They've always been very emotional, very aggressive. The left tends to be slightly less happy with that. But you see the way that those sort of campaigns work. But to go back to your original point, we have to be very careful. But one of the things I'd love to do is to go into schools and get children, primary school, even secondary school, as well as university, and explain storytelling and behavioural economics so that we can all understand how these appeals work. Because I think a lot of the time we don't understand when we're being addressed by emotionally led sort of fake news. And I think it will be a really good sort of thing for everyone to learn so they can see, if you like, the arms that are being used against us.
Thank you very much, Tas. And I would like to let everyone know that we will be inviting Tas back in the future to talk about storytelling. So please do stay in touch. I think it's very important. You can see how the behavioral economics actually tie very nicely with the storytelling framework. And also next week, we actually will be talking about disinformation. So do check out on the website for more webinar news. Before we finish, sorry about the kind of the location on this, some of the words. Just can we go? Yeah, save the dates is important. For those who want to really learn more about behavioral economics from TAS, we do a one-day course in September, and storytelling also in September as well. I think we also have the date in December. For the precise dates, please do check the course page on our website. Tas, if we can move on to the next page, and let's see what it works. So it can come as a off-the-shelf course, or we can tailor it to your specific team or the projects you're working on. So Tas will often do research beforehand, talk to you to make sure that what he deliver in the training is exactly relevant and practical for you, most important of all. For our international audience, we can also deliver this virtually like we are now. Yep. So if we can go move on to the next slide, Tas. Right? Yep. So as I said, next week we are running a webinar on disinformation. For those who are based in the UK, as you are familiar with the recent news about the 5G conspiracy theories, we'll be talking a bit more about that, really dissecting what it's like, how to identify disinformation campaign. So do go on the website and sign up to our training alerts. Tas, our last slide, please. Stay connected. Some of you might have heard about this webinar from our Facebook or Twitter. We are on all social media platforms. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can watch some of our videos. Just before we say goodbye, if I could ask everyone who are still here to just fill in a very short poll. Just let us know how useful you find this webinar. This will help us to improve our webinar series. We can really do more about this in the future. That's it for now. So hopefully we see everyone in the future. Please stay safe and see you soon.